You ever needed reminding of something that you thought you already knew? I remember many years ago, Sarah and I were going on this trip. I think we were dating at the time, and she said, all right, we've got to get to the airport at 4 o'clock. Or we have to leave at 4 o'clock to get to the airport on time. So I woke up, I'm a preparer, so I woke up at 3 a.m. And I get the car fueled up, I get everything packed in the car, got my coffee, and I go over to her house. And I'm expecting her to be waiting outside in the driveway, ready to throw the bags in the car and let's go, but she's not. I don't see her inside the door either, so I call her. And she picks up the phone. It's very clear she has just woken up, and I'm starting to get aggravated. I'm tapping my foot as she walks very slowly. I can see her through the door. And she walks to the front door. She opens it. She looks at me, and she says, 4 p.m., Aaron. 4 p.m. I want to share to you a story that I had shared with people many times as a different way to remind us of God's love in a way that is easy for us to forget. If you'll open with me, if you have your Bibles, to the book of Hosea. Book of Hosea. And we'll start in chapter 1. And like many of the prophets, when you get to Hosea, it launches right into it without really much introduction at all. So here's how it starts. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Now I can't imagine what this was like for Hosea. This was like the first time God speaks to him at all, and it's not the command he was expecting. I can't imagine the shock, and I admire, though, his obedience. God says, go and marry a prostitute. And I don't know, if there's an awkward silence after that. And it doesn't tell us, did God tell him exactly which one? What was that selection process like? But he goes and he finds one. And y'all like how it worked this morning, yeah. And he finds her, and this is the action, and God has a message for him to bring. But this happens a lot of times with the prophets. They're not just given words to say. God says, I want your very life to be an example to the people around you. And so they get married. Can you imagine the scandal that this causes? I mean, the whole situation invites judgment and gossip. Maybe you have seen a couple get married. And people smile at them, but as soon as they turn their backs, the whispers spread around town. People are saying things like, oh, bless their hearts, it will never work. Perhaps a betting pool has started to see just exactly how long this relationship will last. And there's all of these rumors circulating about the circumstances. Can you imagine the wedding? Hosea's family is there, and his mom must have just been in tears. I wanted my boy to be a prophet, but I didn't want this. Bless her heart. You got the wives sitting there, digging their elbows into their husband. God better not be saying anything to you today. And everybody's talking about Hosea and God. Hosea and God. What did you? And this is what God intends to happen. Because with all of that gossip spreading around them, it carries with it a message. Because I imagine people are asking, hey, Hosea, you're a godly man. What are you doing? And he tells them, this is an example. Because like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. Tells the people, this is you. If you would judge Gomer, you are really judging yourself because you've been unfaithful to God. You find this several times in the Old Testament where a prophet will go to someone, present to them a story or a situation, invite them to pass judgment. And when they say, well, this is what should be done, the prophet turns the tables and says, well, you just passed judgment on yourself. Because this is human nature. We all have a blind spot when it comes to justice and ourselves. It's very easy for us to look into, isn't it easy to look into other people's lives and say, well, this is what needs to be done? And yet it's a different thing entirely when it applies to ourselves. I have a friend in North Carolina, very big on the whole law and order thing, constantly talking, we've got to enforce the laws of our land. And it was very interesting when about a year ago, maybe 2 years, in North Carolina, the state released this warning to people that seemed to indicate that they were about to start writing speeding tickets to anybody going even a mile an hour over the limit. And they said, well, this is the law and we're going to enforce it. And all of a sudden, all of that talk about we've got to punish the lawbreakers is like, no! No, they can't do this. This is crazy. They've got to have mercy because now I'm the lawbreaker. And you see that's a different thing when it applies to me. And then when the state clarified, they said, well, we're just reminding people that the speed limit is the limit. We're not actually going to be writing all of these tickets for everybody who drives by. Nobody complained about the sudden mercy that the state had developed. And so Hosea walks around town with his wife, and kind of the message is, to those of you who say that I should not be with her because of her unfaithfulness, God should not be with you. God compares his relationship with his people to marriage. He does this several times. While we were at camp, one of the things that we did is the students, they asked questions, and we sat for more than an hour. And they wrote their questions down on slips of paper, and it was just really an incredible time because they opened up their hearts. And one of the questions, and I talked to the student later, and he said, well, I'm in college now, and I'm being around all of these people I've never met before, and they're from these different religions. Can I still be a Christian and yet find truth and find meaning in other religions as well? Now, in God's eyes, the way that he views our relationship with him, this would be something like me telling Sarah, well, Sarah, there's all these other beautiful women out there, and can I go and chase them around and still be married to you? I don't know if I would live through the night. God has this expectation of faithfulness, of undivided love and fidelity. He even describes himself as being jealous. Oprah Winfrey said in an interview that it was this particular idea, the jealousness of God for us, that turned her off to Christianity. And yet I ask you, is it crazy to think that any husband would have that desire of his wife, or any wife desire of her husband that their love be theirs alone? God expects faithfulness, and yet what he gets from his people is adultery. Northern Israel, for a very long time, had been a place where you could find a variety of other gods that the people worshipped. The land was filled with shrines and monuments and idols and places where they would go to worship these other gods, and their lives were filled with greed and lust and hatred. And yet at the same time, they would still say, we worship Yahweh, the living God, the God of the Bible. And they couldn't wrap their minds around why this wouldn't be okay with them. Hosea 6:4, God tells the people, what can I do with you, Ephraim? What can I do with you, Judah? Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears. It was so fleeting and temporary. It was there one moment and gone the next. And I think it would be a good warning for us before we look back and judge those people and say, how can anybody bow down to something their own hands have made? Maybe we should ask ourselves if sometimes we allow things other than God to take that central place in the throne of our hearts. Sometimes our love for him is as fleeting as the mist that disappears. Not only do they get married, they start having kids. And I think it is safe to assume that people immediately began to wonder if the kids were even Hosea's. In fact, later on, God talking about Israel says, your children are children of adultery. And yet Hosea takes the children as his own, except God is the one who chooses the names. Hosea 1:4, then the Lord said to Hosea, his son is born. Call him Jezreel, meaning God scatters, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. Jezreel is a place where a previous king had murdered a bunch of people. And so, again, everybody is talking about Hosea and his wife Gomer, and then they have this kid, and they say, oh, your boy is so cute. What's his name? He says, God scatters, because God's going to kill all of you. People talk. And then they have another kid, daughter. Beautiful little girl, and then Hosea 1:8 or 1:6, Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. For I will no longer show love to Israel that I should at all forgive them. You imagine that might be a little confusing for this little girl as Hosea goes to her and says, I love you, not loved. And they have a third child. And at this point, I wonder if perhaps Hosea is begging God, look, just let me name him Bob, or I'll even take like Bonfiglio, just whatever, just God, can you let me name one of the kids? And yet God says, no. Hosea 1:8 and 9, after she weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, call him Lo Ami, which means not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. The adulterous woman, Gomer, gives birth to statements of judgment. And just as the people had talked about her and her unfaithfulness and her background, now they have these kids with these really bizarre names that speak of judgment on the entire land. I think that every time they meet someone new, hi, I'm Hosea, this is my wife Gomer, these are our kids. God will scatter you, he does not love you, and you're not his people. I imagine at some point the kids probably got like, come on, Dad, yes, I'm not loved, he doesn't love you, can we just get through the grocery line? Every time the people in town see them walking down the streets, it is a reminder to them, we have been unfaithful to God, and it is bringing his judgment on us. Saying that your idol worship, your sin is bringing this. It might not have given birth yet, but it is coming. In the New Testament, James 1:15 says something similar, that after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Things get worse in their relationship. We aren't given a whole lot of detail, but Gomer returns to her old ways. She was a prostitute before she got married, and she leaves Hosea for some other guy, and she's out there and she's going wild, and her life is falling to pieces. She returns to her old way of life. Perhaps she tells herself that she was never any different to begin with. She was just pretending. Perhaps she is tired of the constant whispers about herself and her kids. Things get so bad that she is put up on the market to be sold as a slave. This would happen to you if you found yourself in debt that you could not pay off. You would be sold as a slave, and that person would own you until your debt was paid off. Her downward spiral is complete now. Maybe she thinks back to the wedding day and what it was like to feel beautiful, if even for a moment. But that's no more. She's wearing something quite different now and about to get a master instead of a husband. And then Hosea shows up. Now think about the public nature of the relationship. And again, they have given the town something to talk about for quite some years. And now she's been running off on him. And people see and they say, oh, poor Hosea. And now the moment has come. Can you imagine as she stands there and everybody turns and they stop talking? There's Hosea. What is about to happen? Because according to the law, he could come up and demand the death penalty for her. That was the punishment for adultery, male and female alike. He could demand that she be put to death. Or would he come and maybe not press for that extent, but just give her a piece of his mind? Because we're all shaming her, and here's Hosea. Hosea, you tell her what she's done. I wonder if anybody began to, in anticipation of what was about to happen, maybe start to pick up some stones. Just so that they would be ready to carry out the execution of what she had coming to her. And yet I wonder, as those people, they see Hosea coming, if any of them made the connection and had to pause for a second as they hold a stone in their hand, ready to chuck it at her head. Wait a second. Isn't she supposed to represent me? Remember the entire relationship. Hold on a second now. God is saying that we're like Gomer. We've been unfaithful to him, and so, wait, if I'm wanting the death penalty for her, what does that say about what God should do to me? And that is the crisis of a holy God who is just and the people who rebel against him. We need to be reminded. Because again, it's so easy for us to call for justice to be done to other people. Other people, they've done us wrong, and we know what justice would be. And so sometimes we pray, God, do what is right to them. They deserve something. I want to see you give them what they deserve. We need to be reminded that each of us, if God were to give us according to what we deserve, it would be hell. And yet Hosea had been given very specific instructions. He was there for a different reason entirely. Hosea 3:1. The Lord said to me, go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. God does not ignore her actions. He does not justify them. He doesn't say, Hosea, go and demand the justice of the law. He says, I want you to go and love her even after she did this. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. Those would be a part of the pagan festivals. And just as Gomer had been running around and was with those other men, God watched his people continually turn away from him. So I bought him for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. This is the going price for a slave. And from this 2 verses, that's how we can kind of deduce what had happened to Gomer, that she was bought like a slave. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you. Hosea goes there, he pays the price, and brings her back into his home. The expectations of the crowd at this point had to be totally confused. They see Hosea approaching, and he's got something in his hand. Wait, he's giving it to the slave master. And he's purchasing her back, and they might even at that point say, well, maybe he's buying her back, and he's going to work her as a slave in his house, reminding her every day, this is what you did to me. You belong to me no longer as my wife. You can only be my slave. But no, he is telling her he loves her. He is walking back, holding her hand, and that day and every day on, they are reminded of something completely different. Some of them might have even said, how can you do that, Hosea? If there was anyone we've ever wanted to see get what's coming to her after what she did to you. And with this new round of gossip comes another message. God tells the people, this is what it's like for me to love you. You do understand that of the two of them, we are Gomer. We're not Hosea, the faithful prophet who does what God commands. We are Gomer, that the result of our fleeting love for God and our tendency to worship and bow down and give our lives to and chase after other things puts us in the exact same position. I have no more right to God's love than Gomer had a right to Hosea's forgiveness. I mean, could Gomer stand up there and look at Hosea coming towards her and say, yeah, you better buy me back. You owe this to me. No more can we stand before a holy God and demand as our right that he loves us. It comes as an extravagant and unexpected and undeserved gift. See, we define love differently than God does. Most of us, if we were observing this situation, we would have said that Hosea's act of love was to marry her in the first place. We would say, wow, that is love. You know, he's willing to look beyond her past. He's willing to give her this chance. He's willing to bring her into his house. But most of us would draw the line. And those, if you have experienced infidelity, it is a deep and lasting pain. And so most of us would define love as having ended at that point. She has burned the bridges, not with a single mistake, but a free and whole abandonment of him. I mean, we like the idea of unexpected grace instead of judgment. We have those videos, they circulate on Facebook of cops that pull people over and oh, surprise, here's a present instead of a speeding ticket. Some of you wish that they would do that more often. Or somebody who appears before a judge and instead of a fine, they receive a full pardon. And yet to endure the public humiliation that Hosea went through, as he paid the cost for her rebellion, we would say that really is a little too much. And yet this is also what Jesus did for us. Our position is Gomer's, and yet Jesus did not abandon us simply to God's carrying out justice. He came forward and endured public humiliation. And he himself paid the debt that we ran up for ourselves. This is what it is like for God to love you. So many times I talk to people and they say, I feel unworthy of God's love. I'm aware of my failings. I'm aware of my past. I know the things that fill my heart. How can God love me? And this whole example of his life is just to illustrate to us there is nobody beyond his love. And yet I would say it comes with it a warning. Gomer could have refused. She could have refused out of suspicion. She could have refused out of pride, saying, I'm not going to have anyone treat me like that in a way I don't feel I can pay back, because there'd be no paying back for this. Then you have a choice. The only way to God is to allow him to love you in that way. You can't set the terms of your relationship with him. Will you allow him to bring you in? Just as Gomer returned to Hosea, God promises that his people will return. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. This happens as the Assyrians come in and scatter them. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. God talks about his people returning. What's interesting is two things. One, the northern kingdom was never reformed. Those people that were scattered as an ethnic identity, they just became blended in with the nations that they ended up in exile in. It was the southern kingdom, Judah, they came back. And he says this interesting phrase, they will return to the Lord their God and David their king. David has been dead for several centuries at this point. And this reference is talking about the descendant of David, the Messiah, who Jesus was, that his people would return to. God declares his intentions to the people. And he would say these words to you today. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. And that is what we see in the cross. God is bringing justice, and yet he takes it upon himself instead of us. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. The church is referred to as the bride of Christ. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. And you have this incredible reversal of the names of the children. Our sin has brought death. Our sin has brought alienation from God. And yet because of Jesus, he calls us who were born not a part of Israel, not of the line of Abraham, those who the Jews would call not God's people. He calls us his people. He calls me son. He calls us loved. Maybe you are someone who feels like, though you haven't done the exact same things, you are in the position of Gomer. You have burnt bridges in your life. You have no one else to point the finger to. And you wonder, how can God love someone like me? And yet, to the unloved and to the abandoned, God says, I want you as my own. If you have turned away from him and run your own way to the end of your rope, God wants to bring you home to him. And all it takes, Gomer had to do nothing. She didn't have to work it off. She didn't have to beg and plead to convince Hosea. She just had to go with him. Jesus calls you to do that this morning. Will you follow him? Will you accept what he has done on your behalf? And maybe you just need reminding of this morning. Of how incredible it is that God loves us. Because there's a freedom in that. There's a freedom in knowing that God, he loved me at my worst. And if he can love me like that, I know that he's going to be faithful. Let's pray. God, sometimes we don't understand the way that you deal with us. Because we come to that point where we would expect justice perhaps for other people, realizing it would mean our own demise, and yet in that moment you show up, willing to take the cost upon yourself, willing to extend freedom and forgiveness, not to bring us under you like slaves that are constantly reminded of what they did to get themselves in that position. You bring us into your family as your children, as your very own, your beloved. Remind us of those things as often as we feel cast out and neglected. That as long as we feel we are beyond help, nothing is too great for you. In Jesus' name.